React component model. Based on the ability of HTML5 to use arbitrary elements, that is, elements that are added that are outside of those defined within the specification, React and many other frameworks use a component model. They break up pages into different parts, called components. Each in turn have their own agency. They are not controlled, but control themselves. In a more traditional model, a web page might have HTML, it might then link to external CSS files, and it might also include JavaScript files, either at the head or use it in the body as part of a defer or asynchronous operation. The page then is treated as a whole. That is, it has its own HTML, CSS is over here, JavaScript over here, but the whole, the page, is treated as an entire document. This is different in the component model. In the component model, each part has its own HTML, its own CSS, and its own JavaScript. It is itself its own whole. The most and only important rule of the component model is the following. Components take care of themselves. This is a phrase I use a lot when I describe the component model, and in fact, I use quite a lot when I'm talking about React, which uses the component model. This is incredibly important summary of the component model. Components take care of themselves. Each component individually handles its own data, its own interactions, and what it renders. That is, it doesn't depend on any other outside resources but itself. It may have child components it deals with, but it is itself its own whole. It's not dealing with external JavaScript or external CSS as part of a page, as part of other files. It's only dealing with the CSS that it cares about, the JavaScript it cares about, and the HTML it cares about. Components take care of themselves. We need to pay special attention to this idea of rendering. Components use the verb render to define what they control, what HTML they use. That is, a component is a part of a page and it renders something. What it renders is certain HTML that it shows. In React, especially in React Native as we get there, the term render chaining is important because it describes how components trigger others. That is, a component may render some section of HTML and may have something it uses. Within that HTML may be the definitions of other components that it then calls. That is, it render chains. When it renders, it has its own HTML. Within that HTML might be other components which then also render. Within that might be other components that also render. So we have this idea of render chaining from one component to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. So let's summarize what I've talked about here. In the component model, the most important rule is that components take care of themselves. Again, this means that each component has its own data, its own interactions, and especially its own rendering, that is, its own HTML it cares about. This is different than the more classic model of having a single page of HTML, an external page of CSS defining styles for that entire page or an entire site, and external JavaScript for that as well. Instead, we break this up into components, each of which handles its own HTML, its own CSS, and its own JavaScript. This actually makes development a whole lot easier because instead of dealing with a whole page, we're only dealing with parts of a page at a time. We're dealing with the components that make up that page, all of which are individually controlled and have their own agency. So we don't necessarily have to care about one thing interacting with another because they won't. Each will handle its own interactions.